Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We can start off with the intros and, while we get the slides kind of get up and running, hopefully, and then we can kind of sort of get started. This is sort of like informal. We want this to be interactive as possible. I'll do a quick intro of myself, and then Elizabeth will do an intro. As you guys know, hopefully you guys are in the right room. So this is a session entitled Beyond R01s and Ks, maybe an R03, R21 is in your next step. I gave a variation of this talk for the ARMED course. For anyone in the ARMED course currently right now, it was like one of the first sessions that I did early on. So some of this may be kind of like an old hat for you guys. So I'm DJ. I'm a medical toxicologist. I'm over at Penn. My research area is mostly focused on animal models of poisoning with diagnostic and therapeutic development.
Hi, so I'm Elizabeth Schoenfeld. I'm at UMass Bay State, and I am in my K right now. And just so we can fit this in the context of other options that you have today, at 11 o'clock you can learn about R01s, and there's going to be a panel of our colleagues with their successful R01s. You can ask them all the questions about R01s that maybe we haven't answered. And then immediately after that, if you want to talk about Ks, there's a panel on why you should get a K and how you should get a K. So you've got all your grants covered today that we can talk about.
We're sort of like in the middle.
Yeah. So we probably should have timed it so that the order went sort of K, R03, and R21, and R01. But there is no actual order to all of these. So.
Yeah. As you guys will see as we talk about sort of this particular mechanisms, it's sort of like depending on where you are in your stage of development, it may fit in better for you, as opposed to maybe going for a K or the full-on R01 and things like that. And we'll sort of talk about similar mechanisms as well, too. So.
And then the other thing is that our slides are actually on your app. So if you want to see the slides, they are there. So that's what we're like, all right, what are we supposed to be talking about? So what are your disclosures, DJ?
Unfortunately, I have none.
But you are currently funded by?
Oh, in terms of grant, yeah. So pertinent for this, I just finished my K this past year. I currently have an active R03, R21s, which obviously I can give my own experiences in terms of like how that went for me and things like that. And then R56, which is like a little bit of a different mechanism. It's not something you can really apply for, so that's why I'm not going to say too much about that. It's just really like 1 or 2 years of R01 funding. So if you submit an R01 and you're sort of like on the cusp, if the PO feels pity for you, they'll give you like a year or two to sort of like, spruce things up and resubmit and things like that. So yeah.
So I'm currently funded by a K. I'm almost in the last year of my K, which means I'm really thinking about which grants to write next. I got an R03 before my K, and so again I was saying there is no actual progression sort of through the numbers. And so in terms of R03s and R21s, that's my experience. And then I'm currently applying for an R34, which is not in the title, but we will mention that. But I would love to know a little bit about you guys. Who has put in an application for an R03 or an R21? Is there anyone out here who has applied? Great, so I figured that there would be a few people. Has anyone put in an R01? Yeah, so we have, great, so we have some R01 people too. Anyone put in a K? Awesome. And who's thinking about putting in one of the ones I just mentioned? So everybody, or maybe in the future, not immediately thinking about it for the future. Great. Well, that is super exciting because you can't get it if you don't apply for it. So thinking about it is definitely the first step. All right, you want to talk about R03s?
Yeah, so the R03, we can talk about that mechanism first before we talk about the R21. So like just the base, for anyone who's not familiar with the R03 mechanism, it's essentially 2 years of funding, typically depending on the institute, but for the most part, it's like 50,000 indirects each year for 2 years, right? So it's like 100 total across the 2 years. And really what the sort of point of the R03 is, just because I think I've sort of spoken to different investigators, and they have different impressions of when should I apply for the R03? Is it a good substitute for a K, and things like that. But as you can imagine, 50,000 doesn't get you very far. So the intention of R03 is not really to apply to buy down your time, as it were, right? That's really sort of the K mechanism, or if you have a like institutional training grant like a KL2 or K12, that's really the purpose of that. The R03 is really designed to fund like a small project, like a very discrete project that's doable in a couple years. It can sort of vary depending on what your area of research is. Elizabeth obviously talked about her experience. My sort of experience with that was applying for to sort of develop a large animal model of CO poisoning. So that was a very focused project, had a very defined endpoint for that. So that's the reason why I applied for an R03. So,
and did you end up using the funding for supplies more than time if it was a large animal?
Yeah, exactly. So the time that I asked for was really like pretty small. I was already on my K, so I was already kind of maxed out on my time. So it was a little bit unusual, but you realize like maybe like 5% or something smaller than that. But the majority really was just like the animals, some tech time, 20% for like a technician to do some of the work. Because as you guys will see, it's, we're only one person, right? It's really, you're not going to be able to do everything by yourself. So you really need sort of like either a technician or research assistant, depending on where your research area is and things like that.
The way I think about the R03, which I don't know, I will get in trouble saying this, is that if you have a project that you're going to do anyway, and you feel like you can get a grant submitted for it, because the R03 is just not that much money, and it is still a grant. And so even though the research strategy is only 6 pages instead of 12 pages, which saves you some time in writing, you still have to pull together every other little piece that you need to pull together for the grant, right? So these grants end up being 100 and something pages, and that doesn't change just because it's an R03. So I do think that there is a lot of an attitude out there that like if it's not a lot of money for the amount of work that you're going to put into it, but if it's something that you're going to do anyway. And so that was sort of my experience. That for me it was an exercise in grant writing, which was really helpful. But the amount of time that I spent working on that first R03, which was my first federal grant, was probably as much time as it eventually got me. So I think it covered 7% of my time for 2 years, and I probably spent that in writing the grant. So that's sort of the limitation of the R03. But on the flip side, I got to say I had an R03, right? And when you put grants on your CV, then that helps you get more grants. And it was a project that we certainly were able to get done, regardless of the fact that it was a small project. So I think that probably is a good transition to R21.
Yeah, I just want to mention a few things just to sort of like close out, and then we can obviously answer more questions like specific R03. So a couple other caveats about the R03 mechanism is that some institutes will use sort of like an R03 type mechanism for other things. So I think a couple of examples I bring up when I sort of spoke during the ARM course was, so NIA, for example, I know through SAEM they do sort of this like, which is aging kind of research. They actually use that mechanism to kind of fund like a mini sort of like startup for young investigators. So people who are like kind of transitioning from like, fellow whatever to like now I'm applying for my K, they sort of like, they actually give a little bit more money. I think it might be like 75 per year or something like that, but it's specifically through NIA. So they use this sort of R03 mechanism for that. Same thing, same deal, 6 pages of science and things like that. There's a sort of another kind of spin on the R03, like if you're in a K awardee, which is actually was relevant to me, you can actually apply for an R03 that's only specific for K awardees. So if you're in your last 2 years of your K, or the 2 years after you finish your K, you can apply for this through R03 mechanism. And the whole idea of this, as you can imagine, is sort of like boost a little bit, some money in your treasure fund to increase your prelim data so you can apply, be competitive for an R01. And sort of what Elizabeth mentioned, it's sort of like building street credit, right? If NIH or whatever federal grant you're applying for sees, oh, this person has an R03, it definitely will build up your street credit too. So as part of that is not only getting money and things like that, but it's also building some street credit. So like they'll believe in you that you can do the work that you propose, which is super important, right? They have to kind of believe that you as an investigator can carry out the work and things like that.
And another thing just to sort of be aware of is that every agency is a little bit different in terms of how much money that is. So my K is through AHRQ, and my R03 was through AHRQ, and whereas NIDA or NHLBI may say it's $50,000 per year in direct costs, AHRQ was like, oh no, that's actually $50,000 a year in total costs. For those of you who don't know the direct versus indirect, direct is how much you can put in your budget for yourself and your collaborators and your staff and your supplies, and then indirect is how much your institution takes. And so everyone's institution takes a different amount, somewhere between 45% and 75, maybe 100%, I think, for some institutions, which means that if you have $50,000 a year to spend and it's in total, you may only get 25 of that towards your budget, which is not a lot if your institution takes 100% directs, or you get 2/3 of it if they take 50% directs. So that's how HRQ does it, as opposed to, so any number that we say may be different based on the institution that you're applying to. It's incredibly complicated.
Yeah, and the common question that sometimes I'll get is, depending on where you are in your stage, right? If you already have some type of protected time, like say you're on a training grant, like a T32 or KL2 or whatever, if you're thinking of applying for R03, I think that's fine because you sort of already have protected time. And you have to realize, I think the general sort of flavor of these grants is that whenever you submit something, expect maybe a year and a year and a half later to potentially get funded. So don't expect to get funded like 6 months down the line, especially with NIH. It's like it's as Elizabeth can attest to, it's like it's very painful in terms of how long you have to wait. But if you're a person at your stage where I'm thinking about my K. Definitely, I would not recommend applying for an R03 if your whole, thing is to get training and, get time and things like that. So.
One thing I should mention when I was sort of down on the R03s actually goes back to that indirects. So the thing that your institution might like about the R03 versus your K is Ks don't actually pay much in the way of indirects. So everything else, the indirects is set at what your institution has said it's set at, and that can be quite a bit of money depending on the mechanism. So R03s, 50% of that total budget goes back to your institution, and for Ks it's much less. So although you may not make as much from an R03, your institution actually may be very happy for you to apply to that because it's actually more money back to your institution. All right, R21s.
Yep. Yeah, we'll talk about the R21. So the R21 is a little bit of an interesting mechanism. So essentially, it's a little bit of a bigger grant than an R03, but obviously not as big as an R01. So it's really, again, it's a 2-year grant, very similar to R03. It's more money. It's $275,000 across 2 years. You don't have to divide it, exactly in half, but essentially it's $2,705,000 in direct costs across 2 years. So it's often referred to as a high-risk, high-reward type of grant mechanism. And so the name of that probably tells you sort of like, if you have something that's sort of exciting, you can get done in 2 years. It may be a potential mechanism to consider, but some of the background stats behind that's something to consider. Even though it's more money, again, it's the design of it is not really for young investigators to buy down your time. Again, that's really the K mechanism. It's really sort of like if you have something that is sort of like, like for me, for example, I wanted to look at a rodent model of CO poisoning, looking at this exciting new therapy. So that was like the R21 that I put in because they were more interested in like the biomarker and therapeutic sort of development. The other thing to consider with the R21 is that if you look at the stats, it's kind of like scary, right? In the sense that the funding rate actually, about 50% of those folks who get the R21, they're like established investigators. They already have a lab, they already have R01s. So you're kind of competing against them in terms of the R21. The other thing to also realize is that the funding rate actually, it's a little bit less than an R01 if you kind of take all comers together. So, with that together, it's sort of like, it depends on where you are again in sort of your development, right? If you already have protected time, you already have some data and you have kind of this idea, then maybe it's something to consider. But again, it's sort of like, even though it's 6 pages of science, it's still taking away time for maybe the R01 that you want to submit. A lot of people, if you like look through the blogs and if you talk to your like mentor, they often will say, why write an R21? You might as well just, put a little bit extra work and write the full R01, right? So it's sort of like, it's a case-by-case thing. When people sort of ask my experiences and do I recommend applying for an R21? Again, it's going to depend on where you are in your sort of stage, how much protected time you have, like what you have sort of in your pipeline and things like that. But I will say, from my own personal experience, when I submitted it, one of the things that reviewers commented is like, oh, this is when I was already on my K. They're like, oh, he's on his K. So that kind of gave me bonus points. And I did have to resubmit it. So it wasn't like I didn't get it the first time. So I had to I got my summary statement. So it was a year and a half until I actually got funded. And so I was already like halfway through my K. So, it's sort of like, but you can get a little bit more time with it and things like that. I know other investigators at our institute have some decent amount of buy down time with the R21 and to sort of help supplement the other things. So
we only have like 3 minutes left, so I'm going to go briefly about
Perfect.
R34s, then we can discuss any of the stuff that we've talked about, and definitely come to the other talks if you want to hear more about the other mechanisms. So an R34 is a pretty cool mechanism, and that is basically to get pilot data for an R01. So my experience with this recently is that my K is about shared decision making with a specific focus on kidney stones and CT scanning and not CT scanning for kidney stones and developing decision aids. So I have sort of built my expertise in shared decision making using kidney stones as a model, but now I'm really much more interested in getting people started on buprenorphine and methadone. So I'm taking my shared decision making knowledge and experience and getting some new research and then creating an intervention. So we've created an intervention, but I could have maybe just gone straight for the R01 and said, yes, I've had this intervention, but they also could have said, well, you have 0 pilot data that suggests that your intervention is going to work or that you're really going to be able to enroll for this intervention. So the R34 is to get basically feasibility data for your study. So it's a little bit of a weird thing to write. It is as big as an R01 in terms of writing it, but you're writing it more about like how you're going to do it and how that's going to help you for the R01. So the R34 can be 2 to 3 years. It's about $450 in direct costs. So you get $150 a year, or you can use it in 2 years and you can have $225 a year. So it's a little bit better than the R21. And then the other thing is that, like, I don't have to be fully powered. The whole point is feasibility and piloting. So I can say I'm going to refine my intervention and I'm going to pilot it on 50 people to make sure all my mechanisms work. And then when I go for my R01, I can say, listen, look what we did already. I've already shown that this is feasible. And then they're more likely to say, yes, we're going to give you the big bucks now because you've shown that you can do this. So that's another mechanism, if you're thinking about something bigger, that you can go for to push you in that direction. I think we're at our time, but if people have thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear your experiences. If your experiences are different from our experiences, I think everyone would benefit from them. Yes? And I think that speaks to another thing, which is if there's a specific call that fits what you're interested in, like that is way better. I mean, I spend a lot of time looking for a grant mechanism for the thing I want to do, and that's great. But if there's an institute that says, we have a special R21 for this thing, for the use of existing data to examine this issue in global health, like that's, if you find something that fits your project, that's really ideal. And so it may make sense to tailor your project to one of these mechanisms if there's a specific RFA out there that says this is what we're looking for. It's blanket. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, that's great. Right, because there's not a lot of supplies for meta-analysis. It's just your time.
Yeah, I mean, the other sort of thing we've got to mention, I know sort of like for those who may be a little bit not further along in terms of like the NIH, like it is a kind of like alphabet soup, like when we talk about institutes and stuff like that. The other thing to realize with these sort of R03 and R21, whatever mechanism you're interested in, is like what institute, like sort of call it like institute shopping, right? Because each institute sets their own pay line, which is basically the threshold you have to meet to get funded. Pretty much if you meet that score or better, for the most part, you should get funded for the most part. But different institutes have different pay lines. So some, like, I know, for example, like NCI, which is cancer, and environmental health and sciences, where I kind of get my funding through, their pay lines are a little bit more difficult, as opposed to NHBI, which is a little bit more generous because they have more money and things like that. But then there's also more people competing for it. So it's sort of like this, sort of you have to kind of figure out which institute kind of better fits your science. The other big thing, I'm sure Elizabeth definitely can mention her own experiences, the program officer, the PO, is probably going to be your best friend. I definitely highly recommend reaching out to them first before you just submit a grant to the institute, because if your science doesn't fit what they're looking for, it could be like the best grant you wrote, but if the PO is not interested in it, it's not going to get funded. So first and foremost, most important thing is reach out to a specific program officer. My personal experience with the R21 mechanism was the PO was a big mitochondrial person too, and so he loved kind of the work I was proposing, so it definitely helped me a lot, for sure. There's no guarantee. I mean, there's no question about it. So that's like another sort of tip to consider too as well with sort of these mechanisms. Yeah, lots of time for questions.
Questions or other comments, other people's experiences? Yes. You could. You couldn't necessarily. For those particular ones, you couldn't use the same grant because they're two very different what they're looking for out of the grant. But so, for example, if your K fit at AHRQ and your K fit at somewhere else, you could theoretically submit Ks to both those institutes. I think you're theoretically allowed to do that. Yeah.
You can't double dip, basically. It can't be like they're not going to fund the same project.
Right, you won't get right.
Yeah, just change the title. Change the title,
roles.
change some things, and then it's fine usually. Yeah, but definitely can't be identical.
and this is not an all-inclusive session on everything about
Yeah.
NIH
Yeah,
grants,
yeah,
but there's all
exactly.
sorts of other stuff to cover the details. If you have a moment, there should be a QR code either on a table or as you walk out on one of the tables. Please scan the QR code. It's like a 3-question survey, not just about this session, but about what other sessions you want to see next year. So this is really the best way for us to gather data and know what you guys need. So for example, it sounds like we still have a lot of questions about, all the different aspects of federal funding. So like, what are the particular aspects of federal funding that you want to hear about? Or maybe what we need is sort of a general federal funding session that's maybe more than 20 minutes. So.
Yeah. And Elizabeth and I are on the SAEM research committee, so we, like every month, we sort of like talk about exactly these sort of things that come up, what would be important for you guys. Just, for emergency medicine and, investigators are interested in kind of establishing themselves. Obviously, a big plug-in for the ARM course. I'm not sure if anyone in the room is part of the ARM course, but it's basically like I think it's a year-long, right, course where, people apply and they kind of get accepted to a class where they, get all the basic tools to establish a research career. So obviously this is a little bit more geared towards like younger investigators who are maybe finishing residency or fellowship and they're trying to get up and going and things like that. So another plug for that too as well.
Yeah, we're always happy to talk to people about your path through research and what it should look like.
Yeah, it's pretty diverse as you can tell.
I guess we're not getting kicked out of this room.
Yeah.
So we'll be here and feel free to ask us any questions or anything.
Great.
Yes. I don't know anything about it. I've heard of them. They sound
Yeah.
really interesting. What do you know? Tell us. These are the ones where you. Yeah, I think this is really interesting because we don't always think about partnering with businesses, right? For some of us are very much in our sort of academic lanes, but that there are all these grants actually within NIH where you partner with businesses to develop products that will that will affect people's health in the future, but also may actually build a business. So if you're somebody who's interested in devices or tech solutions to health problems, there are really some interesting grant mechanisms out there. Yeah, thank you. Maybe that's what we need. We need an hour-long, let's talk about all the mechanisms and get a lot of these out on the table, because I think a lot of us don't know about some of the stuff that's out there. So it's good to hear about what are the other options that maybe we hadn't considered.
Yeah, just what Elizabeth mentioned before, just like another thing to also consider is that she mentioned sort of like finding grants. She spends a lot of time finding her grants, like the appropriate mechanism. And that's like so true. So if you're at an institution that has like a strong research, support staff, their job is, some of them is, really looking for grants that are appropriate for like people in the department. And, another example I can think of in terms of the R21 mechanism, since we're talking about it, is there's a talk-specific program called Counteract, where their whole thing is looking at, agents of terrorism, things like that. Just a year ago, they actually had a call off for R21s for early-stage investigators, usually people within 10 years of their sort of residency or clinical training that, you get basically bonus points, and only you could apply for that if you're like an early-stage investigator. So those things are like kind of hard to find. So it is like just like finding the right grant mechanism and things like that for your work is like half the battle.
Yep.
So that's another good point that Elizabeth brings up. But all these sort of like even though we say vanilla R03, R21, there is a lot of sort of variations on that. And that's sort of some of them can be geared towards exactly to folks in their room.
Other experiences. Thank you guys so much for getting up early in the morning to join us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So it's great to see everyone, and I'm looking forward to hearing about all your accepted grants. But remember, it's going to be 2 years from now that we're talking about them, which is why you should apply for things you're going to do anyway, and then you'll be done by the time you get your grant, and you still get the grant.
Yeah. We'll be here if you want to ask us any questions. We're happy to answer it. Thank you.